Al came forward to reveal his participation in the astonishing Philadelphia experiment, that he had survived time warping, invisibility, and electromagnetic zapping. Let's give a hand of applause, if you will, to Al Bielek, the lecture for this hour. Al?
I'm not quite used to all of these bright lights in my face, but I'll make the best of it. How many of you here know something of the Philadelphia experiment and what it was all about? Apparently not a great many. In spite of my lecturing around the country and on the radio. But you can't expect everyone to know everything about all of the secret projects that the government has engaged in over the years. The Philadelphia experiment, so called because in the final phases it took place in the Philadelphia harbor in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, was not originally known by that name. In fact, it didn't start in the war years. It started in 1931 in a fairly obscure place known as Chicago, at the University of Chicago. And the three original participants were Dr. Nikola Tesla, Dr. John Hutchinson, who was then Dean of the University of Chicago, and a staff physicist by the name of Dr. Emil Kurtenauer. They did what we today call a feasibility study, which is, well, let's look at this thing and see how can we possibly make it work. And there was a lot of interest in invisibility at that time. It had been in the popular press, and things like popular mechanics, popular science, or speculation, how one might do it. So they sat down and decided to try and come up with a working solution in terms of modern technology. Nothing much happened in the first 2 years, in fact, the first 3 years. In 1934, this project was transferred out of the University of Chicago to the newly formed Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton, New Jersey. Now, the Institute is not part of Princeton University, but is on property owned by the university itself. And the original people who staffed it up was only 4, Dr. Albert Einstein, Dr. John von Neumann, a Dr. Alexander, and a Dr. Oswald Veblen. The staff increased as years went on. Of the beginning of this project, they continued in that humble means of study. But in order to understand what they were studying and what they were doing, I have to give a little background history as to the, shall we say, the scientific background that preceded the start of this project. I'll give a thumbnail sketch of the principles who were involved and also some of the other European mathematicians who laid the groundwork. The first man involved, Dr. not von Neumann, but Nikola Tesla, was born in 1856, Smiljan, Croatia, now part of war-torn Yugoslavia. Of poor parents, his father was a priest, and his mother was illiterate. He wanted to go to engineering school early on. His father wanted him to become a priest. He eventually relented and let young Mr. Tesla attend a university school of his choice. In 1879, his father died and left him with no funds to continue, so he had to go to work. He continued to monitor classes as best he could, but nevertheless he went to work first for the telephone company in Budapest, and then later on he went to Paris. That was in 1882, and he became part of the Continental Edison Works, continuing during this period to argue with his professors about AC theory and that sort of thing. He didn't get anywhere. He finally decided he needed green pastures, much greener than he could find in Europe. So he emigrated to the United States in 1884, quite broke, had 4 cents in his pocket. A book of poetry he wrote, a command of 11 languages, but most important of all, he had a letter of introduction to Thomas Alva Edison from the works manager in Paris. He was introduced to Edison, went to work for him for about 6 months, and left over a dispute of money. Went back to ditch digging or whatever he could find, and in that period of the first year and a half, finally he met the then president of Western Union Corporation, who apparently had a great deal of faith in what Tesla had said and was doing, funded him with the first laboratory, gave him a check for $35,000, and sent Nikola on his way. In the succeeding years, he made quite a mark for himself, both in terms of engineering and in terms of social life. He became part of the Institute of Electrical Engineers, newly formed in New York in 1884, and he was a regular lecturer. Eventually, at one of those lectures that was attended by George Westinghouse, who became very interested in his AC power system, which he demonstrated at that same lecture, and funded him by buying all 20 of his patents then issued in the U.S. for the entire AC power system for $1 million cash and a royalty of $1 per horsepower. Needless to say, this put Mr. Tesla well on his way to funding anything he wanted to do. Very briefly, he built the power generating equipment for Niagara Falls, the first major hydroelectric power station in the U.S., beat Thomas Alva Edison out, who wanted to supply DC. It's ironic because today we're going back to DC, and that's a different story. In any case, he built the Niagara Station. In the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, he demonstrated two-way radio. This was in 1893. Some 9 years ahead of Marconi, who won world acclaim for being the first person to transmit across the Atlantic in 1902 a Morse code signal, letter S, from Italy to Newfoundland, and won the international award and the acclaim. It seems, however, that he stole the ideas and the technology from Tesla because he had visited Tesla in New York in his laboratories some 9 or 10 years previously. In any case, Tesla continued on. In 1898, he demonstrated a radio-controlled boat in Madison Square Garden, another first. 1889, he went to Colorado Springs and for 2 years did basic research. Held a press conference when he was completed with that work and announced something of what he had done. He then went to J.P. Morgan, who had been his financial backer for a number of years, told them he could transmit sound and images through the air, what we today call radio and television. J.P. Morgan's eyes literally lit up. He says, if you can do that for me, Mr. Tesla, you have all the money you want. He built the Wardenclyffe Tower in New York, and it was nearly complete when Mr. Marconi was the first to transmit across the Atlantic, and J.P. Morgan lost interest after that. He also completely dropped out when Tesla announced he wanted to demonstrate free transmission of electrical power. That didn't exactly sit well with the power elite because they were making a vast fortune off of the AC power equipment with standard transmission wires and transformers and everything we know today. So he was eventually dusted out of the textbooks, college textbooks. And the only thing you will find him known for today was the fact that he developed the Tesla coil. That's the only thing they'll admit to in the books. It's a terrible tragedy because the man practically founded single-handedly our industrial establishment as we know it today, due to his contributions of AC power, radio, fluorescent lighting, and a few other things, over 450 patents. But nonetheless, he went onward with his laboratory work, met Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1917, was asked to do work for the government during the war, which he readily did. And in 1919, out of the remains of the American Marconi Company, which was seized by the government in 1917, a new corporation was formed called RCA. I think everyone's heard of RCA. They started up in December of 1919 and took on board many of the engineers from the old Marconi Company, including Nikola Tesla. He became engineer, chief engineer, later on the vice president and director of engineering and research worldwide, a post he held from 1935 to 39 when he retired in 39 with a huge retirement party held for him at Cherry Hill, New Jersey, RCA offices. The public record says that he became a recluse in 1931 and stayed in his little hotel room in the Hotel New Yorker for about 12 years and conveniently died on 7 January 1943. Nothing could be further from the truth. They were as busy as 12 years. He demonstrated in 1931 a Pierce Arrow automobile converted to electric power with a 75-horse motor under the hood and a little black box on the dashboard which picked up free power from an unknown source. He had a lot of press coverage on this. He also drove it over all of New York State, apparently. And what happened to the car after that, nobody seems to know. And he was involved in other research as well as the Project Invisibility. His contributions were enormous in many areas, but that's just a little bit of a background of Tesla. Now, there are other people who made contributions. Very briefly, in 1863, you had a Dr. David Hilbert born in Germany, who was a profoundly revered mathematician, a PhD in mathematics, developed 5 new systems of mathematics, including what is called today Hilbert space. That's a neat term, which is a means of trying to describe what he did, namely how you mathematically describe multiple realities and multiple universes. Very important to what came later in the 40s. Hilbert taught in the German university systems until 1930. Dr. John von Neumann, many other people met him during that period. And he retired in 1930 and died in 1943. 1879, Albert Einstein was born, Ulm, Germany. He had his PhD in math and, of course, developed the special and then the general theories of relativity, 1915 for the latter, and had worldwide acclaim and was teaching in the German university systems until 1930, when at the urging of friends who thought he had better leave while he could, because they saw what was going to be coming in the future, they literally smuggled him out of Germany because the National Socialist Party did not want him to leave. They thought he was a national asset, contrary to some of the other stories you may have heard. And he was smuggled into the U.S., went to Caltech in Pasadena, California, taught there for 3 years until he was invited to join the staff of the Institute, which he did in 1933 and remained there till his death in 1955. 1903, Dr. John von Neumann was born in Budapest, Hungary, and he was a prodigy with mathematics from an early age. Eventually he liked to hedge his bets. He took a degree in chemistry in 1925 and his PhD in math in 1926. He also taught in the German university systems for 4 years and left for the United States in 1930. Before he left, he met and talked extensively with Dr. Hilbert, met J. Robert Oppenheimer in Germany, who figured in the latter part of von Neumann's life. And he left for the U.S. in 1930, taught at the Princeton University Graduate School until he joined the staff of the Institute in 1933. 1905, T. Townsend Brown, I'm sure many people have heard that name, was born in the U.S., Zanesville, Ohio, eventually acquired a degree in engineering, and that was just before the Depression years. He had problems getting work. Who didn't in those days? And he joined the Navy as a reserve officer. In 1938, the Navy tapped him on the shoulder and said, "You're in the Navy now, and you have a whole department you can head up, minesweeping." So he made contributions to that, including the development of a system to explode the new German magnetic mines at a very safe distance from the hull of a ship. And that technology was very similar to what was developed a little bit later for the Philadelphia experiment. And he did make a contribution to that experiment I'll cover later. 1912, the last and perhaps most important, but one of the important people, was Dr. Norman Levinson, born in 1912 in the U.S. A little can be learned about him. I know very little of it, his life, but he was a professor of mathematics, assistant professor at MIT until 1955, and full professor from 1955 until his death in 1976. His primary contributions, however, was the development in secret of the time equations and the time matrix, which was absolutely necessary for what happened with the Philadelphia experiment. Von Neumann, I might add, after meeting Hilbert, developed his own mathematical systems, sometimes known as von Neumann algebra, more accurately described as the ring operators for those who may be mathematicians. Well, all these people made their contributions. Various people got together at the Institute: von Neumann, Tesla, Einstein, Alexander, Veblen, and others. And in 1936, they had a working piece of hardware. It worked partially to produce invisibility in one of the older buildings on the property. I'll show you the slides. You can see what it looked like. In 1940, they had a fully successful test in the Brooklyn Navy Yard with revised equipment using Tesla's design of a full analog system, and a Navy tender, approximately 250 tons, became completely invisible to the eye, and to the camera for that matter. And everyone was elated, including the Navy and Roosevelt. The Navy responded by immediately classifying this project and calling it Project Rainbow. And of course, everyone had to get a clearance. And they set up offices in the Philadelphia Navy Yard. And then at that point, Roosevelt said to Tesla, well, I'm going to give you a real ship to make invisible now. And he assigned to his care and testing a battleship, which was pulled into the back sections of the Philadelphia Navy Yard. Now you may ask, where do I fit in this picture? It's a good question. I'll give you the answer. I was not born Al Bielek. I was born Edward Cameron in 1916, 4th of August, son of Alexander Duncan Cameron Sr., who was a Navy man at that time, had a career as a Navy man. We don't know when he joined the Navy because those records have disappeared. As I like to say today, the records were sanitized. And we only have one picture of him in the Navy, and that was in 1917 in his bosun's mate first class uniform. But he was a ladies' man. He loved his ladies. And I was born in 1916 to one of his live-in marriage women. And Duncan, my brother, Duncan Cameron, named after his father, Alexander Duncan Cameron Jr., was born in 1917 in a different location in the New York area. I was born in the Bayshore area of Long Island, and Duncan was born up in Connecticut. Came the war in 1917. Father was tapped on the shoulder by the Navy and says, you're out to sea in service now. So he abandoned his two wives, live-in type. They weren't legal. I've checked the records. And of course he led on with his life in the Navy. We were raised by Auntie Cameron in the big house in East Islip, Long Island. Completed our regular schooling. Father insisted, and he did come home once a year around Christmas. We see him for typically a week, maybe 2 weeks, that we must get a good education. So we did. I went to Princeton. Duncan went to the University of Edinburgh, Scotland. He took a PhD in physics in the summer of '39, and I took a PhD in physics in the summer of '39 at Harvard. I met Dr. von Neumann on the campus at the university in Princeton, and he insisted I should go to Harvard to get my PhD. It was, in his view, a better school at that time. So I did. I did not learn until much later why he had such an interest in me. That's an interesting, long story. In any case, we both graduated in the summer of '39 at Father's insistence, who had left the Navy on December 31st, 1929 with a heart condition and a pension. We joined the Navy in September of 1940, 50 Church Street, New York. Were given commissions, Lieutenant JG, and sent to a special Navy 90-day wonder school for special officers and their special programs. We graduated, and in January of 1940, we joined the project at the Institute. We thought we had a good education at Harvard or at Edinburgh in the cutting edge of physics and mathematics. Well, we quickly found out how little we knew, because the real cutting edge was at the Institute of Advanced Study, which at that time was considered the premier think tank of the world. They were way ahead of the schools and the universities, and they were dealing with time matrices, and they were dealing with five-dimensional realities and a few other things which we had never heard of. Be that as it may, we were brought up to speed. We did make some contributions. Primarily, the Navy wanted us there to make classified, detailed reports on the project. And we shuttled back and forth from the Institute to the offices in the Philadelphia Navy Yard. And the project went on. And in 1941, January, the Navy tapped Duncan and myself on the shoulder and said, it's time that you learn what the Navy's all about. You're going out to sea for a year. So they gave us a nice plush assignment on the USS Pennsylvania, which was the flagship battleship of the Navy. It was Roosevelt's first choice we went to sea. And we cruised around the Pacific for about 9 months. October of 1941, the ship came into Pearl Harbor for overhaul and dry dock, and we took leave to San Francisco. On December 5th, our orders were cut for a return to Pearl Harbor, December 5th. We were about to board a plane at the Naval Air Station when we were intercepted by a Navy captain who said, your orders are canceled, gentlemen, come with me. So we did. We were taken to an upstairs room of the Naval Air Station and met Hal Bowen Sr., who was then the director of the Office of Naval Engineering. Today they call it the Office of Naval Research, and that name change occurred in 1946. But he told us, he said, "Gentlemen, we have reason to believe the Japanese are going to attack Pearl Harbor within 48 to 72 hours. We don't want you there. You're too valuable to us. Finish out your tour time in San Francisco so you can do paperwork for the Pennsylvania. You can do tour work for the Pennsylvania paperwork. Finish your tour out in San Francisco. And when that's over, in January you'll return to the Institute, and there'll be nothing but hard work." So we did. We had a ball in San Francisco, returned to the Institute in January of 42 to see preparations nearly complete for the test of the battleship. And Dr. Tesla was having fits. He was saying there's going to be a very severe problem with personnel. We've got to do something about this. He went to the Navy, and the Navy refused to give him any further time. They had assigned a test date for March of 42. And he had a choice to make. Either you go ahead with the test and hope that everything comes out all right, or you cancel the test in order to save the lives of personnel. He chose the latter. He sabotaged the test. Nothing happened. And he bowed out, said the test is a failure. I have other things to do. And you have a very good man here who can take over, Dr. John von Neumann. Well, there are two versions of this story. One says he left, the other says the Navy fired him. In either case, he left. I think the volume's a little too high. That's better. And von Neumann took over it with his own approach. He decided to change the analog approach to a fully pulsed system and make a few other changes. In fact, a lot of change in basic engineering and hardware. And he made certain other selections with the Navy's approval. Number one, he wanted a ship which was designed from the ground up for this test. He went to the drawing boards at the Newark Navy shipbuilding yards, not specifically Navy, but a lot of Navy ships were built there then. Picked a number off the drawing board, DE-173, which later was named the Eldridge, and said, "I want the interior left unfinished and gun turret number 2 unfinished, just a big hole there, because I'm going to load a lot of heavy equipment in the hold of the ship." Ship came down the ways in September of 42, went to dry dock, had the heavy equipment installed. That was 2 very large 75 kVA alternators, which went down through the hole, were bolted together with the gear drives and the motor drive, and slid on rails to the center of the ship. And a very large diesel-electric generator to power this system separately from ship's power, about 8 megawatts output, was also installed, and all the other heavy equipment. And then it was taken out of dry dock, went under its own power to the back regions of the Philadelphia Navy Yard for final outfitting. And the final outfitting with electronics took place from roughly December of 42 through the first 3 months of 43. Now, we were back fully on this project from 42 onward, I should say the barely 43 onward, and we were there to lend whatever assistance we could. We insisted to von Neumann that there would definitely be a problem with personnel, and he eventually agreed. He tried to study this thing and come up with an answer. Briefly, I'll get a little bit of the physics in here, so maybe you'll understand why. In any case, he decided to try and build a counterfield with a 3rd generator. They had enough problems synchronizing the other 2 large ones, but they did finally with special electronic equipment. But the 3rd generator, which was intended to build a counterfield for protection of personnel, never worked properly. They couldn't synchronize it with the rest of the system. And along about May of 43, one of the technicians assigned to us was zapped, went into a coma, went to the hospital, and eventually after 4 months he recovered and was mustered out of the Navy. So it was back to square one. Von Neumann dropped that idea in that system, and he proceeded with the original design. So they were ready for their tests along about late June. They had sea trials for the Eldridge, and then in July they decided they were ready. They'd already chosen a volunteer crew, went throughout the Navy during the summer of 42, found 33 sailors and some officers who they went through a special training program at the Coast Guard Academy at Providence, Rhode Island, or it was Groton, Connecticut then. A 90-day training program again. My father was at the head of it, and we have a picture of this, one of the few pictures that survived. And they were assigned to the Navy Yard awaiting their final assignment to the Eldridge. The normal crew on a ship of that size was 150 personnel, but for the purposes of this test, they only wanted about 15 sailors and 6 officers, enough to take the ship out into the harbor, set it stationary, motionless, but not anchored, and have the properly trained crew members, Duncan and myself, to run the equipment and proceed with the test when they were ordered to do so. Now, what did they intend to do with these tests? The primary purpose was to make the ship invisible to sight and to radar. Now, in 1940, they had no problem making that tender invisible to sight, but they were not concerned with radar at that time, which is merely an extension of light energy, but at a much lower frequency. But there were no personnel on that tender. So now we have a situation where you have a ship with personnel on board and where the power is much, much higher. Let me give you an idea of how much power was involved. In the final design of Van Neumann, you had 2 75 kVA alternators, which were pulsed at a low frequency, and they drove 4 Tesla coils on the deck of the ship. These were single spirally wound coils, copper tubing. And there was a lot of amperage going into those 4, and there was a rotating magnetic field that was generated. There were 4 radio-type transmitters, AM transmitters, with boosters designed to be able to put out 2 megawatts each, CW. That's far beyond the standards of radio broadcasting in the United States, which gives you a 50,000 watt limit. Here we were running 2 million watts each, 4 of them. And they were pulsed, which says the peak power went up still higher. A special antenna had been designed by T. Townsend Brown for this test. For the operation, there was a quadriphase antenna fed by these 4 transmitters, and all of the other control electronics were down in the control room, which I'll show you with a picture of the Eldridge where it was. So it was very high-powered equipment, and there was good reason to be concerned. Up to that time, humans, to our knowledge, had never been exposed to such extremely high electromagnetic radiation, and nobody had a track record or history of what might happen. Today we do. Today we know what will happen. It was partly as a result of that test and other tests made since. In any case, they did proceed with the test. First test, July 22nd, 1943, on the Eldridge, out into the harbor of Philadelphia. The orders came from a carrier with an observing group aboard, which included Dr. Van Neumann and a Navy captain by the name of Captain Harrison. The orders were by radio for us to fire up the equipment. You see, there were no computers in those days. There was not very good means for remote control, so it was decided to have 2 men there who knew what the system was, namely Duncan and myself, to run the equipment, and in case something went wrong, be there to shut it off, or do whatever we had to do. On orders, we turned the equipment on. It was about 1,000 hours, and for 20 minutes, everything appeared to be perfectly normal and the way they wanted it. The ship was invisible to radar and invisible to sight, with nothing but a haze around it. But the captain noticed something he didn't like through the binoculars from the deck of the carrier. There was a water line around the ship, but it was a huge water line. That is to say, it was much further out from the ship than one would expect. Nobody had prior experience as to what was going to happen, but nonetheless, he couldn't see the bottom where the water was under the ship. And he was concerned that due to the gutting of the interior of the Eldridge, that it might break in half if it was not supported by water. Well, it was supported by water, but it was invisible. So we ordered the test terminated in 20 minutes. We went back to dockside, and then they found we had a problem with the crew, that part of the crew which was deliberately stationed on deck as observers to see what they saw from the inside. They were very sick, nauseous, disoriented, mentally out of it, and physiologically pretty much out of it. So they were pulled off. Everyone else behind steel doors or below deck was quite all right. The Navy said, no problem, we'll give you another crew. They had the other half of the test volunteer crew available. But Van Neumann says, we have a problem. I had to study this, find out what we got to do to try and prevent this problem with personnel. So the Navy demurred for a few days, a week, and then finally they came up near the end of July and said, you have a drop-dead test date of the 12th of August, 1943. You will either complete the test by that date or forget it. Nobody could understand why. I went to Hal Bowen Sr., who is the director of the Office of Naval Engineering, and asked him, what's this all about? And saying when we have to finish an engineering test by. He says, well, I know it came from pretty far up the line. He says, I don't know why. I'll check into it. He did. It came from the CNO, Chief of Naval Operations. It was then Admiral King. And those were the orders. It made no sense. Because the Chief of Naval Operations is concerned with the conduct of the war in all theaters of operation insofar as the Navy is concerned. And he is not concerned about engineering tests. But he transmitted the order. We didn't know then where it came from. We've long since have found out. And the answer is in my lecture tomorrow night on the Montauk Project. Nevertheless, we had that date. We're stuck with it. We modified the equipment somewhat, particularly because the Navy somewhat relented on the requirements. They didn't need optical invisibility. In fact, they didn't even want it. They just wanted radar invisibility. Otherwise, without all of the modern navigational systems we have today worldwide and radar, if you couldn't see a ship with a radar and you don't have navigational worldwide systems like LORAN and SHORAN, you've got to be able to see where another ship is in the fleet or a convoy. Otherwise, at night in bad weather, you might ram it. So they decided we had to be able to see them optically by eye with binoculars where they were. They only were concerned about the German Navy, and particularly the U-boats with their radar, which was very good, that they would not be able to spot our ships coming across the Atlantic. That was the thought, that was the intent. Needless to say, they did have a problem in the final test. Might add, too, the Germans were working on their own system at the same time of invisibility, because they were not satisfied with a 50% kill rate. They wanted to raise it still higher. Well, they're opponents in the war, you can expect this. And they started experimenting on submarines. There were approximately 3 German subs who were outfitted with special invisibility gear, supposedly make those ships invisible to Navy sonar and radar. And when they tested their systems, all 3 ships disappeared and were never found again, the submarines. So they abandoned the program. So what happened to the Eldridge? On the fateful time of the 12th of August, they had a second crew on board. They had outfitted the hull of the ship with special pressure testing equipment to test the actual hull pressure, internally and externally, hydrostatic pressure test. And a submarine was available to go under the Eldridge and see where the waterline was and what was going on. At the last minute, they had some kind of problem. They pulled the entire second crew off, put them on the sub, and pulled the sub out of the area. By then we knew something was wrong, but then they told us, go ahead with the test. So we were quite concerned, Duncan and myself, but we had no alternatives. We did proceed with the test. On orders, radio, we threw the appropriate switches and turned everything on. For about the first 70 seconds, everything seemed in accordance with the plan, i.e. it was radar invisible, but the ship was still visible through a greenish type haze. And then the ship vanished completely from the harbor, no waterline, nothing, in a blue flash of light. Needless to say, Van Neumann and the Navy were very concerned, very upset, panicked is the right word, and where the ship was gone for 4 hours. No sign of it anywhere. Finally came back 4 hours later in the same spot in the harbor, and it was obvious something was wrong. Through binoculars, they could see that the special radio mast was broken, part of it was missing. There was superficial damage on the ship, and the people were milling around on the decks, and nobody was responding to the radio commands and attempts to communicate. So they sent a special launch out with a boarding party to find out what was really going on. So they boarded the Eldridge, and they found out all right. They found 2 men buried in the steel decks, dying. 2 more buried upright in the steel bulkhead, dying. fifth man with his hand buried up to his wrist, like that, in steel. He lived. They cut his hand off and gave him an artificial hand later. And all of these four personnel died. One of them in the upright bulkhead was our younger brother Jim, 6 years younger, who enlisted in the Navy after World War II started, after Pearl Harbor, and volunteered to be part of this special duty crew. And he wound up drawing the straw, so to speak, for the second test. Well, he died that way. Duncan disappeared. And of course, with a special crew, the Eldridge, which was not damaged in terms of navigational ability, was brought back into the harbor to its dock, and then we had 4 days of inquiry. What went wrong? Everybody made a report, including myself. I told them what happened. They didn't believe me. And Van Neumann didn't believe me either, and he says, I'll talk with you alone later. And they finally opted for a third test in the outer harbor at night. They put new equipment in. The equipment was badly damaged in the hold. It was smashed and wrecked. I'll tell you in a minute why. They opted for a third test, install new equipment. They already had 9 or 10 sets of spares, and the main generators were undamaged. Put in new equipment, and in late October, about 10 o'clock at night, 2200 hours, on 1,000 feet of remote control cable with no one on board ship after they were on station and removed personnel, they threw the switches and turned the equipment on, and the ship disappeared and came back about 15 or 20 minutes later, a smoking ruin again in the hold of the special equipment, at which point the Navy threw up their hands, says, we quit, stripped the ship of that equipment, put in the normal war equipment, and sent it to sea. It saw war duty in the Navy operations from roughly January 1, 44 until sometime in 46 when the Eldridge was put in mothballs. Stayed there until 1951, I believe, when it and another destroyer were transferred to the Greek Navy. There was quite a ceremony for this. Greeks inherited it, called it and renamed it and called it the Leon. It's still in service in the Greek Navy today. We just had feedback on this a few months ago. And the U.S. Navy wants to buy it back. They say for a museum piece. Whatever the reason, they do want to buy it back. But the logbook, which under maritime law must remain with every ship from the date of commissioning until it is decommissioned, was with the Eldridge or Leon. The Greek Navy went to the logbook to find out what had happened to the Eldridge before they bought it. They had heard some rumors too. Every page in that logbook prior to January 1, 1944 had been ripped out. So there was no real record of what happened. Now, I want to show a few slides here, and then we'll get into the final phase of the experiment, what happened. I don't have too much time, but let's proceed with this. See, are we on? Yes. I'll swing over here a little bit. The Institute of Advanced Study, as I had mentioned, was founded in 1933, and in 1939 they dedicated the new Food Hall, which was their administrative building, and that's a picture of it. See, in 1989, after my memories of the Philadelphia experiment came back, I went back to look at some of the old areas I knew I had been in. I took a lot of pictures. Now, the original staff members, you have here Dr. Alexander. I think everybody has seen pictures of Einstein smoking with his pipe. Dr. John Van Neumann, taken in Europe before he came to the U.S. Dr. Oswald Veblen, who were the 4 original members of the staff. And a picture of a very famous German mathematician, David Hilbert, who never left Germany and was not part of the project, but his work was a major part of it. Now, in wandering around the, shall we say, the university grounds, Graduate University, I eventually went into Food Hall, and they have this huge library there, which is where I found some books I couldn't find previously, namely those of Dr. Norman Levinson. He wrote 5 mathematics treatises and books which are available in the open literature. But I was looking for reminders in my past, and out in the courtyard and back of the graduate school, you can see it's a very elegant, very old school, second oldest in the U.S. It's over 150 years old. And I found other things of interest, like this pine tree. Very tall, very old. No part in the experiment, but it caught my fancy, so I took a picture of it. And the interior of one of the study halls in the graduate school, which had a very familiar feeling to me. Very elegant mahogany woodwork. The school is very well maintained. All of these things had memory to me, including this chapel, Princeton Chapel. And some other things happened after that experiment failed. I had a girlfriend. If any of you saw the movie, The Philadelphia Experiment, one of the two sailors who ran the equipment, namely myself, had a pregnant girlfriend who I wanted to marry, but the Navy wouldn't allow me to see her. We were under quarantine. So I asked von Neumann, I said, look, I don't want a child born out of wedlock. I want to marry her. Can you arrange this? And he said, I think I can. They didn't control him on the campus at all. So we arranged a wedding in the chapel with a Navy chaplain. And we were married, and the son was born in 1944, February. And I remained in the Navy, and eventually was moved to Los Alamos and became part of the atomic bomb project from July 44 to July 47, as did von Neumann. This was the laboratory where much of the work was done on the Philadelphia experiment. The laboratory building still stands, but is no longer a laboratory building in the sense of having a working laboratory. A lot of classrooms. Let's see if we hang one up there. It's there, but it's not too visible. Wandering around the back section of this lab building, I found a room which was extremely familiar to me. A blackboard where von Neumann used to explain the theory of what we were doing. And the corner where I usually sat, sometimes with Duncan, while they explained it. That hasn't changed there at all, not even the furniture. And we also had the old 36 lab building, green wood. It's now almost falling down. It was a functioning building then, which the first test was conducted in. Now it's used for storing of vehicles. And a little closer up, that section in the forward part still has a few pieces of lab equipment left. In 1933, when von Neumann was asked to join the staff, he had a formal letter of offering by then Director Abraham Flexner. He was offered $10,000 a year salary, an unheard of amount in those days for a college professor. He accepted, of course, and other assistants who came in later were paid $1,500 to $2,000 a year, which was the more normal stipend. He was asked, or I should say the director was asked in 1942, what's John von Neumann doing here? He wrote a letter back to the questioner. The final paragraph, which you probably can't read in this letter, made oblique reference to the Philadelphia experiment, saying that he was working on a classified Navy project, which, if successful, would materially shorten the war. That was all the mention I could make in those days of that experiment. This may be a little hard to see with the lights, but I'll try to point it out to you. This is a picture courtesy of AAA of the Philadelphia area, and I'll show you where the Navy Yard was on this map. That was the famous Philadelphia Navy Yard, as you see it on the map. Now, if you were to go into the front entrance to the Navy Yard, you would see an entrance like this. I'm talking about the Philadelphia Navy Yard. It's the same today as it was in '43. This picture was taken in the summer of '91. See, in those days, they didn't have superhighways, but now they have I-95 with a bridge over the major river there, and you can park off to the edge of the road and take all the pictures you want of the Philadelphia Navy Yard. Whatever security they had once is long gone. But in 1943, this is what it looked like, a photo taken from an aircraft, and it was vastly different. In the back, you would see no buildings. The back section was where the classified work took place. There was an entrance section or bridge, drawbridge, over to the left, and down in the lower right was the office buildings where we were. Today you will see the Navy Yard much like this, loaded with ships and storage. It's quite expanded from those days. And to give you a little idea of the Philadelphia Navy Yard as it is today, that is of '91. In terms of the Eldridge file photo, it had 4 gun turrets, 3-inch diameter guns. Number 2 was left uncovered, and this was taken according to the legend on there on the 12th of September 1943, at sea perhaps, but let me point out a few things. Turret number 1, gun turret number 2, not covered, dummy, 3 and 4, control rooms right here, where we did all of our work, control the equipment. See an entrance door, that's where we came out, went in. Special antenna at the top of this main mast. That special antenna was, of course, built by T. Townsend Brown, and all of our major control equipment was inside that steel control room, which was literally on deck. In 1943, they received a telegram, of course, at the Institute announcing the death of Tesla. He died 7 January 43, stating the funeral would be held on the 10th of January. It took 2 weeks for all of the people who came from all over the world to view the body to go through that line. So they held the funeral over for 2 weeks so that everyone who came in who wanted to see the body could. And more people came in from overseas and from the United States. They had a much better reputation in the 40s overseas. T. Townsend Brown in younger and happier days. Now, a lot of equipment has turned up over the years that came from the Eldridge. How do I know this? It's because of the vibes that are on it, which is a term which those who are sensitives understand. When the ship disappeared, and I'll finish out the story now, when the ship disappeared, we, of course, Duncan and I were in the control room, and we knew within about 30 seconds something was very wrong. We tried to shut the equipment off. We went for the main power switches. They were frozen. We couldn't budge them. So we got the bright idea with all kinds of arcing taking place in the control room, which had no business being there, and we didn't know what was going on, and we couldn't shut it off. So out we went through the bulkhead door, went out on deck, saw all these Navy people milling around. No one was buried in the decks then. We got the bright idea, jump overboard and swim ashore. Well, at that point, with the fields on, you could not see anything beyond the railing of the ship. Nevertheless, we jumped overboard, expecting to hit the water in the bay. We did not. We started falling and falling and falling, and eventually wound up standing on dry land at night with our backs to what was obviously a military fence, a chain link fence, and suddenly a bright light overhead. There was a searchlight on a helicopter, but we knew nothing about helicopters in those days because in '43 they were almost a toy. Sikorsky was still working on perfecting them for the military. Nonetheless, this bright light beamed down on us, blinding really. MPs came out of nowhere, grabbed us, took us to a building. We got on an elevator and went down several levels. The elevator door opens and we're met by an elderly gentleman with white hair, a civilian. Everyone else down there seemed to be military. And he said to us, "Welcome, gentlemen, I've been waiting for you. I'm Dr. John von Neumann." We looked at him and he said, "You're who?" He said, "You're Dr. John von Neumann." We were still quite dazed, frankly. He said, "You couldn't be. We left him an hour ago and he's a much younger man." I said, "I'm sorry, I am the same Van Neumann you knew 40 years ago. You're no longer in 1943, you're in 1983, and you're at Montauk, Long Island, part of the Phoenix Project. Welcome. Well, we thought he was nuts. Well, we were there about 12 hours total. We found out later we arrived about 2 a.m. in the morning of the 12th of August, 83. And they gave us the cook's tour. Huge computers, computer control systems, hard disk drives, control systems, graphic displays, color TV, large screen, and all kinds of electronic equipment, none of which existed in 43. And we sat down and started to watch TV. Well, you see advertisements for 747 jets and discussions about man and the moon, and you know, a couple of views of modern superhighways and the gigantic traffic jams. We soon got the idea that something was drastically wrong, and we finally had to accept what he told us. Then he sprung it on us. Well, gentlemen, you're going to have to go back to the Eldridge. Oh, just how are we going to do that? Well, we'll send you back. And how are we going to do that? Very simple. We control space and time here from this project. We can send you anywhere as we want at any time we want. So they sent us back. And the instructions were to smash the equipment on the Eldridge because it had enough fuel in the generators to run 30 days if something didn't break down first. And it had built and was within what is called a hyperspace bubble, which was growing. And the two experiments, 43 and 83, both 12th August, had locked up and pulled the ship out of the harbor of Philadelphia and in this hyperspace bubble. Now, a hyperspace bubble is nowhere physically. It is describing an artificial reality which is not of this Earth or not of the solar system as we know it. It's outside of it in a manner of speaking. But as long as those fields were functioning and intact and surrounding the ship was intact and the personnel on board were intact. But it was creating a massive problem which he said threatened possibly the Earth itself, and the equipment had to be destroyed in the Eldridge, and we had to go back to do it. So we did. We smashed it with axes. As the generator started to wind down and we smashed enough control equipment, we knew they were winding down and the thing was over. We went back out on the deck of the ship, and that's when we saw the buried personnel. And we both saw Jim, and Duncan took one look at this. And he decided he didn't want any part of it. And he looked at me as he jumped overboard and disappeared because the fields took almost 2 minutes to totally collapse. And he went back to 83 sometime in that period at Montauk. We found that out in the records later. And he was no longer seen in the time of 43. I remained. We had our inquiry. And of course the project was scrapped after the final test. I remained with the Navy until 47, family and all. And that's some more of the story. May not have that slide in there. Okay, this is one of the pictures taken in that era of Einstein consulting with the Navy personnel. In July of 43, he was a consultant to all the projects, and the Navy, of course, saw him on a very regular basis. Dr. John Van Neumann in a happier pose and a happier day. He was much of a party animal when he wasn't working very hard. He used to have big parties at his own home in Princeton, New Jersey, and he'd find some unusual hat that some woman brought in. He'd model it himself. He had some real crazy ones. Then they had picnics when he was up at Los Alamos. He loved to go picnicking. And I was there, and I was part of some of them. But we also had, as part of the documentary of his life, this picture which came out of somebody's file. On the left, you have Dr. John Van Neumann. On the right, Dr. Stan Ulam, who was a tennis partner of his as well as a scientific colleague. And in the middle, a young Navy man who I've not been able to positively identify, but everyone who looks at it says it is a very close resemblance to me, and probably was me, because I was there at that time. That gentleman in the middle, the right age bracket would have been 26, 27 then. Van Neumann, as the whole project, including the bomb project, was over, wasn't too happy a man. Another one of his colleagues, he worked together with this man to build and design the all electronic digital computer between 46 and 52. And that is a photo of the working model, the first one built. It's now in the Smithsonian. And Neumann, as he aged and became sick, he did come down with cancer. It was considered incurable. And in 1956, he was testifying before Congress on some matter in a wheelchair. Formally, he died of, and officially of the record, he died of cancer in 57. It's not so. He's still alive today. I'm sure many of you heard of the Federal Protected Witnesses Program, in which an identity is changed and the person may be moved to another location, but they continue essentially the same work they were doing. That's what they did with him. They gave him a pseudonym. He had to be kept around. Many people ask, what proof do I have that he's alive today? His book lists, of which there are 2 pages, this one and the other one, have books on it. You can't read it from there, which were published, written and published well after his alleged death, up until 1970. He also designed the Z100 computer for Zenith Electronics in 1980. And that was admitted to by office personnel at the main plant when a friend of mine, Preston Nichols, bought surplus 2 of the personal computers, Z100s. They had the schematics, but no signatures as to who designed it. And he called the company and asked, who designed this? And they looked it up and said, oh, it's Dr. John von Neumann. He says, well, when did he leave there? He says, well, we haven't seen him since 1980. Of course, he went on and was still part of the Phoenix Project, which is another long story I'll get into tomorrow. Everybody thought the whole thing was over. The Navy had buried the project, denied it ever happened, and told the same thing to all the families. Sailors had disappeared and died or whatever, were lost at sea. Whatever excuse. And they were all excuses. But in 1955, a paperback book entitled The Case of the UFO, written by Dr. Morris Jessup, arrived in the in-basket of the office director, the director of the Office of Naval Engineering, or then the Naval Research, Admiral Firth. The book was a standard paperback, but all of the footnotes on the margins were handwritten, dealt with conditions in outer space and an experiment called the Philadelphia Experiment and a few other things. Everyone read it, and finally they called Jessup himself down there, after setting up a commission, of course, to study the thing. And if you look in the extreme left, the man who headed it is George Hoover, is a Navy man, but there are a number of other distinguished people in there, including in the lower right seated Dr. Werner von Braun. And they read these notes and they called in people, and it seems like Dr. Jessup became very interested in the Philadelphia Experiment, started an investigation of his own, wound up with a huge file in 1959, and called a friend of his, a Dr. Valentine, who is still alive today, said, I'm coming over for lunch. I think I've got the answer to this thing, and I'm bringing my notes. The public record says he never arrived, and he was found dead the next morning of monoxide poisoning in his car in a park in Dade County, Florida. As an alleged suicide. Caused a furor in the press. As a matter of fact, he did arrive for lunch at Dr. Valentine's, received a phone call warning him that his life was in danger, and supposedly gave the file to Dr. Valentine, who buried it somewheres, and we've never found it. No one's found it since. And Jessup eventually left after lunch and was accosted and died in his car. And I know from a witness who I ran across, who only talked with me once and wouldn't give his name, that the man was murdered. And he was an eyewitness to it, and told me about this on the phone, and I've never had any opportunity to investigate it further. But Jessup became a martyr to this whole thing, and but never died again. The project seemed to crop up here and there in the press repeatedly from that point on. Von Neumann retired from the government service in 1983 after the crash of the Phoenix Project and went to his upstate New York home. This is a photo of it after the fire, in which it's rather ruined. He lives in a trailer. In fact, that was a trailer he lived in. That's not the trailer. That's some of the other buildings on his property, loaded with electronic equipment. A trailer, and my rental car was mine on one of my visits. In this picture, you will see Preston Nichols on the right, and the man leaning down with a hat on is Mr. Decker, who is a pseudonym, is actually John Van Neumann. As Van Neumann, as a younger man, notice the bushy eyebrows, the cast of the chin, the ear on the right, taken October 5th, 1992. We took him to dinner, the four of us. If you look closely, you will see he appears just about the same, other than the loss of hair and the white hair and the jowls. I have every reason to believe it is the same man. Well, apparently we lost one. No, I think we're out of, no, we're not out of slides. Okay. A lot of equipment's turned up, including this frequency meter, at his trailer, which has the vibes on it. Having been through it and finally recovered my memories, I could recall what it felt like then, and it felt the same. Equipment leaves a particular identity pattern or signature. This was another piece of equipment that turned up. It was the master pulse generator used on the Eldridge, had the same vibes. I think we're having a problem with slides. One of the radio receivers that was used, another one that was used on the Eldridge. It still works. Preston has it in his collection. Built in 1941. It shows the outline, all tube circuits. Okay, quickly in the family, there was my grandfather. Picture is 1891. My father was born in 1891. Picture of him in 1901, 10 years old. Picture of him in the Navy in 1917. In 1941 in his Coast Guard uniform as a volunteer. And that was some of the citations he received from the Coast Guard for 3,000 hours of volunteer service. I think we're losing a couple here. He liked to go fishing upstate New York as he aged. And that was another shot of him on his fishing trips. He had a boat fleet. He had to go to sea. He built all kinds of sailing vessels and had a small fishing fleet, which he eventually abandoned. And this was the family home in Long Island. It still exists to this day in East Islip, a 23-room mansion, which is now maintained very well and is a landmark officially for the city of East Islip. That was Brother Duncan. I will have to cut the story short here. He was born into another body in 1951. This is Duncan. In the age of 8 approximately, a little later at the age of 10, 17 down in Florida, and he graduated from Marblewood School in Connecticut. I was with Father before he joined the Air Force at the age of 18. Much later, 1982, when Father died, he inherited the beach house and some money, bought a catamaran. The picture's not clear, but he had terrible vibes at that period. He was part of the Phoenix Project, which I'll get into tomorrow, and what that program meant, and why we locked up to it. That's in 1986 as a carpenter. And, oh, we got one that's upside down, turned around. 1989. In New York at a UFO Club meeting, in 1990 in the Whole Life Expo meeting, and trying to sell equipment with Duncan and Preston together. I've never met the family since, but my son is still alive, and there's strange reasons why I know this is true. In 1965, I received this magazine from the state of New Mexico. I bought property. And on the next page, it showed a picture of the year before's activities and cattle judging and such. And I immediately spotted this person in the middle. Who, for whatever subconscious reason, stirred me rather heavily. Later, I blew this up, and that's a close-up. For reasons I know now, that was by some reasons or accident. There's a picture of my son. He's involved in agriculture most of his life, living in New Mexico, and he happened to show up. I never did find him then, the next year, or even as late as 1990. There's always been government interference in trying to meet with him. They will pick him up and abscond with him if necessary, and it has been done. I think we're out of slides. I know he's alive. One of these days I will meet Jeff. He knows finally I am alive because of circumstances involving Preston and a famous 4-hour underground videotape, which he finally managed to see, like so many other people on this planet. Tells the whole story of the projects and what happened to me. The rest of the story of why this thing locked up, and I might add very quickly, in '47, I was removed from the Navy, given an enormous brainwashing, and was sent back to 1983 to do it, and the project again at Montauk. Not only was I lifted of all of my memories Edward Cameron, but I was reduced in physical size to a kid of about a year old and then plugged into the Bielek family in 1927. They proved they could manage and manipulate space and time any way they wanted. So I grew up as approximately the age of 1 in 1927 onward as Al Bielek, remembering nothing whatever of my involvement in either project. And along about 1985, I was invited, after I became an engineer, I went through school, I was invited to come visit with Preston Nichols on the island, and I went there in August of '85. And we went to Montauk. For the first time, he thought we were all exposed to this base with its buried projects, unbelievably bad vibrations there. But on my second visit to the same location in May of '86, where we documented it, and those photos I'll show you tomorrow night, my memory started to come back of being involved in the Phoenix Project as Al Bielek. And later on, in '88, it happened to be January, on a Saturday night on HBO, they were showing the movie, The Philadelphia Experiment, which I had not seen prior, or the actual movie in '84. And that jogged my memory enormously that night, so that I started to remember the Philadelphia Experiment and the fact that I was involved. From that point on, as history, recovering more memories and more data, and eventually going public. My first lecture on the subject was in September 1990 in Phoenix, and caused quite a stir even in the press. And I've not done anything else but lecture since, and do some writing, and tried to bring this to the public for the simple reason I feel that the public should know how the government, I'm not going to blame the Navy in this case, but the government can manipulate families, people, and individuals, lie about what has happened to some of your loved ones, whether it be Vietnam or World War II, and cover up totally what they may have actually been involved in or used for. I don't think it's right, and I don't think anybody else as an American thinks it's right either. But this is the way the government has functioned and worked for years. They have what they feel are their reasons for covering security, as they call it, national secrets, whatever. Much more can be told. I'll do that tomorrow night. And I thank you, since I'm being pushed to quit. I thank you all for your attendance, and if you come tomorrow night at 9 o'clock, I will finish the story. That's a Montauk Project. Thank you.